Plunder on the Right by Alan Crawford, Chapter 2, read by Fax Fivem. Chapter 2, Plunder on the Right.
Regania, Regania, we struggle to exist. Our country is not on a map, it's on a mailing list.
Quote by Washington humorist Mark Russell.
Some people say they can't understand what becomes of all the money that's collected for campaigns.
Quote from George Washington Plunkett, from Plunkett of Tammany Hall.
The fat cats are dead.
According to an obituary pronouncement of Herbert Alexander, a political scientist at Princeton who's the nation's acknowledged expert on campaign finance. The new kingmaker, Alexander says, is the specialist who can arrange for small contributions or can connect a candidacy to a fundraising network that can get him qualified for matching funds quickly. Behind almost all of these networks on the right, as one veteran of conservative political struggles told me, is one man.
The real effect of the Watergate campaign reforms has been to vastly increase the power of one man, Richard Viguerie. Once you have limited the amount of money that big contributors can kick in, it becomes necessary to reach thousands of small contributors. And Viguerie, more than anyone else, is the proven master of this.
Who is this powerful Richard Viguerie, operating in his windowless, temperature-controlled, professionally guarded high-rise offices in Falls Church, Virginia? An intense and somewhat diffident, but nevertheless cheerful man with rapidly thinning hair and a weary physique. Viguerie, a political rightist, handles only mailing list clients who share his political views. The son of a middle-management petrochemical executive from Texas, Viguerie attended law school in Houston, but left to work full-time in the late 1950s for Young Americans for Freedom in New York. A businessman, he is also an ideologue. He has said that his political views were formed in admiration of the two Macs, Douglas MacArthur and Joseph McCarthy. Beyond generosity he's shown some of his employees, he has been known to treat them to European trips for annual Richard A. Viguerie golf tournaments in Scotland. He is an unprepossessing individual, not given to lavish tastes or high living. A dedicated family man, he sends his children to a private Christian school run by fundamentalist Protestants, though he is a Roman Catholic. In 1980, he moved from his large home in suburban Virginia to a townhouse in Washington, D.C.'s Georgetown. His lists form a composite of the American right. He sometimes exercises great control over the political organizations with which he is associated. The consolidation of that goes far to account for the growth and influence of the new right. Viguerie is an unanticipated consequence of the Watergate campaign reforms, which, ironically, were supported largely by liberals who hoped to curb the campaign finance abuses of Richard Nixon's committee to re-elect the president. In October of '74, a post-Watergate Congress enacted sweeping campaign finance reforms, limiting the amount of money individuals were allowed to contribute to political campaigns and extending federal control over the election process. These reforms set up a system for federal matching funds. They limited the amount of money that can be spent by individual presidential candidates. The Federal Election Commission was created to monitor compliance. Although the new rules were designed to reduce the role that money plays in elections, they did not succeed. They simply shifted the source. The role of the traditional kingmakers in American politics, the fat cats, was indeed reduced, but the power of a tiny number of technicians who have learned to raise small amounts of money from large numbers of contributors has vastly increased. Now that individuals are limited to contributions of $1,000 to any candidate in a primary or general election, candidates must seek money from a large number of supporters. Viguerie is the acknowledged expert at reaching these supporters. Direct mail solicitation is the core of his strategy.
He's a genius at it,
another right-wing fundraiser told me. But Viguerie is not the only direct mail specialist on the American right. A number of his former employees have gone forth like disciples to spread the new gospel on their own. They did big business in the late 1970s, raising money for Republican candidates and right-wing organizations. A handful of newcomers have entered the field as well. Pax Vobiscum, Pax being spelled P-A-C-S rather than P-A-X. The rise of the direct mail fundraiser has resulted in a proliferation of political action committees, or PACs. the federally sanctioned campaign finance organizations through which individuals can band together to promote or oppose candidates or causes. Under the new campaign laws, PACs must make periodic reports of their activities to the Federal Elections Commission. In 74, the number of PACs registered with the commission was 516. In 76, following passage of the new rules, 650 new PACs entered the field, and by 77, the total was 1,360. By 78, when the Supreme Court okayed the formation of PACs by corporations, PACs were growing at a rate of one a day. During this period, they raised more than $77 million with direct contributions to candidates for federal office, totaling more than $30 million.
These are not just numbers.
Senator Adlai Stevenson, Jr. of Illinois told his colleagues.
They illustrate a revolutionary element in American politics, the rise of single-issue politics, paralleled by the rise of focused single-interest funding of campaigns.
Thus, no party and no comprehensive program is supported. Rather, a single issue, such as opposition to gun control or abortion, is the heart of this fundraising and political action. Candidates are to be elected or defeated on one issue only: reward or revenge. PACs are not, of course, new to the political scene. No sinister innovation invented by the strategists of the new right. Labor PACs, like the AFL-CIO's Committee on Political Education, have played a prominent role in partisan politics for years. Nor is the clout of these so-called special interests, as their critics call them, unique to the right. Harley Staggers, the labor-oriented West Virginia Democrat who heads the House Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee, and no new rightist himself, received 82% of his 1978 contributions from PACs of many persuasions. Until the rise of the new right, Democratic office holders and incumbents received the majority of PAC contributions. Thus, in the recent past, the PACs served to strengthen the congressional status quo, but after the campaign reform laws were enacted, small special interests became more bipartisan. Much of the money now raised went to new right candidates, Democrat and Republicans, and causes. The clout of the new right is a result of their expertise in the field of direct mail solicitation, an art they have been refining for years and have only recently employed for specifically political purposes.
Direct mail has allowed conservatives to bypass the liberal media and go directly into the homes of conservatives in this country,
Viguieri said to the 1977 Conservative Political Action Conference.
There really is a silent majority in this country, and the new right now has learned how to identify them and communicate with them and mobilize them. It is our best way to offset the unions' lavishly funded political organizations.
Huck Walter of the National Right to Work Committee told Conservative Digest, explaining his group's reliance on direct mail. Since 1978, conservative PACs have actually been raising vastly more money than organized labor. Direct mail solicitation is a sophisticated business that has increased in sophistication since Marvin Liebman, a conservative fundraiser in New York City, kept the names and addresses of contributors to Young Americans for Freedom on 3x5 index cards in the early 1960s. The mailing list is the most important element in the operation. Computers maintain the lists of names, addresses, and other relevant information, thus eliminating costly duplication. These computers also make it possible for solicitors to direct their appeals to specific audiences. William Rusher links the resurgence of the American right to the mailing lists accumulated in the 1950s and 60s by Liebman and others.
Prior to the draft Goldwater movement of the early 1960s, modern conservatism had developed a respectable body of doctrine and academic spokesmen, but lacked organizational clout. The successful drive to take over the Republican Party via the Goldwater candidacy provided that clout. Goldwater's landslide defeat by Lyndon Johnson was, of course, a bone-crushing disappointment. But it did not alter the fact that, in the process of drafting Barry Goldwater, conservatives all over America had gotten to know each other. The mailing lists accumulated during the Goldwater campaign were the foundation of all subsequent organized political activity on the part of American conservatives.
Goldwater was the first major political candidate for whom supporters conducted a large-scale campaign to solicit political contributions through the mails. In the 1964 presidential campaign, his campaign staff marked more than 15 million fundraising appeals and raised $5.8 million at an estimated cost of slightly more than $1 million. Goldwater received 380,000 responses with contributions under $100 each, which went far to disprove a long-standing conviction that direct mail appeals could not be counted on to raise large sums for political campaigns. The Arizona senator's success, however, was soon surpassed by another presidential hopeful, Alabama Governor George Wallace, in 1968. Wallace's fundraiser was Viguerie, who had been tutored in the art by Liebman when Viguerie was running Young Americans for Freedom's fundraising operation out of Liebman's New York office. For Wallace, Viguerie raised an estimated $6 million, then an unheard-of sum, to be accumulated through mailing appeals. Direct mail accounted for 76% of the income for the Wallace campaigns. By the 1972 presidential campaigns, George McGovern, rejected by the Richard A. Viguerie Company as too liberal when he asked Viguerie to raise money for him, used another direct mail company to raise more than $15 million at a cost of about $4.5 million. By 1976, direct mail fundraising had become standard procedure in American political campaigns. A constellation of conservative PACs operating with Viguerie's services was raising more money than the Republican National Committee and its House and Senate campaign committees combined. And a staggering $6 million, as much as was raised for Wallace, a presidential candidate in '68, was raised for one senatorial candidate. The impact on American politics has been phenomenal. In '72, existing conservative organizations raised about $250,000 for the congressional races, but by '76, new right PACs, excluding the traditional conservative groups, raised $5.6 million. Unlike most of the older PACs, such as the American Medical Association or the AFL-CIO's Committee on Political Education, which supported primarily incumbents, the new right gave most of its money to challengers. Victorious insurgents made great inroads in Congress, see Chapter 11. According to a Gannett News Service analysis in 1978, certain new right PACs had much more success than liberal or labor groups. The right-wingers represented in the study by the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress spent 5 times as much as the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, yet 19 of the incumbents it supported were beaten. The analysis, according to Garnet reporter Pat Orovensky, showed
that the activist New Right, which has been making steady gains in both houses of Congress, got by far the most for its money in November's voting.
Business and corporate PACs did relatively better than the labor and liberal groups, though not nearly as well as the New Right. Having already amassed a small fortune from his advertising business, Viguerie now maintains a staff of 300 non-union employees in the offices of the Richard A. Viguerie Company, or RAVCO, in Falls Church, Virginia, a Washington suburb. His apparatus sends out 100 million pieces of mail a year from some 300 mailing lists that contain the names of 25 million Americans. His inner sanctum is guarded by 2 different security systems, and even Viguerie himself must produce proper identification before guards will let him in. In his office are 3,000 reels of magnetic computer tape containing the names and addresses of more than 10% of the population of the United States. 2 giant computers leased for $2,700 per month operate 24 hours a day. High-speed printers and tape units churn out the letters, which are packaged and mailed from various Viguerie businesses in Northern Virginia. Though he began in '65 with a $400 investment, Viguerie now claims to turn away 90% of the potential political clients who approach him, and the business is said to gross about $15 million a year. His start in business is interesting. He handled Young Americans for Freedom's fundraising, but was fired. John Falca reported in the Washington Star that Viguerie took the mailing list with him when he departed. From that inauspicious beginning, he began his flourishing business. Viguerie's clients, for the most part, have been political right-wingers more interested in issues like busing, gun control, and sexual permissiveness than, for example, free market economics. Among his clients have been conservative books for Christian leaders, No Amnesty for Deserters, Citizens for Decent Literature, now known as Citizens for Decency Through Law, the National Rifle Association, Gun Owners of America, Conservative Caucus, and the National Conservative Political Action Committee, or NCPAC, names that reflect Viguerie's personal range of political concerns. But as discussed later in this chapter, RAVCO has also been heavily involved in raising money for non-for-profit charities. As a result of his high fundraising costs, officials in Ohio and New York have pressured him to sign consent orders agreeing to hold his fees to a certain limit, which varies from state to state. Rejecting the notion that his constituency will finally give all they can afford to give and then cut off the flow of money, he maintains that lists of regular contributors can be expected to continue growing by 20 to 25% for the next 3 to 5 years, reaching 8 million Americans by the year 82. Television figures prominently in his plans. He envisions using 30-minute television messages devoting 25 minutes to discussion of a political issue and then fundraising appeal in the last 5 minutes. Viewers would be asked to call a toll-free number to pledge donations. He publishes a newsletter, The New Right Report, and a monthly magazine, Conservative Digest. And he is considered starting a weekly newspaper and venturing into the production of radio programs. Other New Right fundraisers plying the direct mail trade and successfully competing with Viguri include Bruce W. Eberl, a longtime activist in Young Americans for Freedom, who learned the business as a Viguri employee and began a direct mail business of his own in the basement of his home in suburban Virginia in 1974. Within 2 months, his business had expanded into offices in a commercial building in Virginia. Business continued to boom at such a rate that the growing staff moved again in November 75, by this time occupying 9 offices and a conference room plus graphics department. Eberl formed the Omega Mailing Company that year and signed a direct mail contract with the Ronald Reagan presidential campaign. For Reagan, Bruce W. Eberl and Associates raised more money in the shorter period of time than any other presidential candidate. The Reagan campaign ended up in 1976 with a surplus in excess of $1 million. The Eberl staff of almost 20 employees that year took over 1/2 of the 7th floor of a large office building in fashionable Tysons Corner, Virginia. A number of other New Right activists are also getting into the direct mail business, and an increasing number of clients clamor for their services. Alan M. Gottlieb, an ambitious young New Rightist associated with the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, has handled fundraising for the American Conservative Union and is now building an empire of related businesses in Washington state. H. L. Richardson, a California state senator once employed by the John Birch Society, has his own direct mail business in Sacramento. Another conservative fundraiser called Richardson's Operation, a carbon copy of Viguri's Ravco. The mailing lists accumulated by the fundraisers and their clients are often exchanged, usually bought or sold, but sometimes loaned. In 77, for example, State Senator John Briggs of Orange County, California, crusader against homosexuals, used the mailing list built by Anita Bryant's fundraiser to support Proposition 6, his anti-gay rights ballot measure. As Marvin Liebman told me,
ever since the direct mail business took off, there's been an entire army of hustlers emerging. Brokers, public affairs consultants, copywriters, mailing house operators, an entire army.
George Will has referred to the right-wing pen pals as
quasi-political entrepreneurs who have discovered commercial opportunities in merchandising discontent.
The key to all of these appeals is anger and fear. As Terry Dolan of the National Conservative Political Action Committee told me, his organization's fundraising letters try to
make them angry
and
stir up hostilities. The shriller you are,
he said, the easier it is to raise funds.
That's the nature of our beast,
he explained. The fundraising letters of the New Right groups depict a world gone haywire, with liberal villains poised to destroy the American way of life. After reciting a list of horrors about to be perpetrated, the signatory, often a prominent right-wing activist or politician, asks for help from the recipient, frequently requesting his participation in a survey or poll. Then he is asked to contribute and told how his $5 or $10 contribution will be used to further the counterattack on the liberals. In the case of a political campaign, almost invariably launched to defeat some quote-unquote radical incumbent, the donor is told that his $10 will be used, for example, to maintain a phone bank for a given period of time. The more specific they can be, the fundraisers have learned, the more likely they will be to receive a contribution. They try to get the donor involved, or at least get him to feel that he is involved. The letters vary according to the organization and the fundraiser, but stylistically there are great similarities. They address "Dear Friend." They employ direct personal warnings of what will happen to you. They use rhetorical questions. They cast blame on a vaguely identified enemy. They offer a way out. Most could have been written by a single hand. The following letter is from the Americans Against Union Control of Government, signed by Executive Vice President Donald Y. Denham.
Dear friend, what would you do if your home caught fire right now? Call the fire department, right? But what if they don't answer? What if the phone keeps ringing while the flames rage through your home, destroying valued possessions, perhaps even taking the life of a loved one? That might sound like an impossible nightmare to you, something that couldn't possibly happen. But it has already happened. City after city in America has been shocked recently by illegal strikes by police and firemen unions. And I wanted to write to you today before another illegal strike called by the big union bosses endangers you and your family, to tell you how you can help prevent such a disaster.
This one is from the Free Congress Research and Education Foundation, Incorporated.
Dear friend, do you believe that children should have the right to sue their parents for being forced to attend church? Should children be eligible for minimum wage if they are asked to do household chores? Do you believe that children should have the right to choose their own family? As incredible as they might sound, these are just a few of the new so-called children's rights laws that could become a reality under a new United Nations program if fully implemented by the Carter administration. If radical anti-family forces have their way, this UN-sponsored program is likely to become an all-out assault on our traditional family structure.
From Save Our Children, Incorporated, underlined in red and signed by Anita Bryant.
When the homosexuals burn the Holy Bible in public, how can I stand by silently? Dear friend, I don't hate the homosexuals, but as a mother I must protect my children from their evil influence. Do you realize what they want? They want to recruit our school children under the protection of the laws of our land.
From Citizens for the Republic, signed by Executive Director Lynn Nofziger. Facts 5 here. This next sample has a lot of parts that are written in all caps, so if I appear to be yelling, you know why.
Dear friend, you can bet that somewhere in the vast labyrinth of the federal bureaucracy there's a file on you. It may be a Social Security record, an FHA record, or an OSHA record. It may be at HUD or the Department of Agriculture, or it may be at the Federal Elections Commission. Big Brother government will go to any length to keep a tab on you.
From Americans for Life, signed by Ohio State Representative Donald E. Buzz Lukens.
Dear friend, please take a second right now to look at the outrageous pro-abortion political propaganda I've enclosed. And then help me stop the baby killers by signing and mailing the enclosed anti-abortion postcards to your U.S. senators. You'll find a list of all U.S. senators on the back of that sickening baby killer propaganda. These anti-life baby killers are already organizing, working, and raising money to re-elect pro-abortionists like George McGovern, South Dakota, Congressman Robert Drinan, Massachusetts, Senators John Culver, Iowa, Frank Church, Idaho, Birch Bay, Indiana, men who apparently think it's perfectly okay to slaughter unborn infants by abortion. Abortion means killing a living baby, a tiny human being with a beating heart and little fingers, killing a baby boy or girl with burning, deadly chemicals, or a powerful machine that sucks and tears the little infant from its mother's womb. And to my way of thinking, that's just plain murder. Yes, I'm harsh when I call these senators baby killers, but it's time we expose them for what they are, if they want to. Talk about abortions, then let's unite and perform an abortion on their political lives. Abort them at the ballot box and save innocent babies who've done nothing wrong.
From the Conservative Caucus, signed by Howard Phillips.
Dear friend, I think you will appreciate more than most Americans what I am sending you. I have enclosed 2 flags, the red, white, and blue of Old Glory, and the white flag of surrender. And I want to show you, by these 2 flags, what is at stake for America under the SALT II treaty with Russia. If the U.S. Senate ratifies SALT II, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, negotiating by Kremlin boss Leonid Brezhnev with Jimmy Carter, it will mean the permanent surrender of the United States of America to the military superiority of the Soviet Union. You and I must choose, and the Senate must decide whether we will personally accept the white flag of surrender as America's banner, or whether we are prepared to work and sacrifice to keep Old Glory perpetually raised on high.
In a textbook case of new right mailbox campaign tactics, Washington State Congressman John E. Jack Cunningham, in a special election in 1977, faced a liberal Democrat Marvin Durning for the congressional seat vacated by Brock Adams, who had resigned to become President Carter's Secretary of Transportation. Going after Durning's blue-collar Democratic constituents, Republican Cunningham scored the upset of the year, garnering 54% of the vote. He portrayed himself as a self-made man with middle American roots, and depicted the Harvard-educated Durning as an Ivy League lawyer whose real allegiance was to the liberal establishment in Washington. Making jobs the number one issue, Cunningham accused Durning of favoring defense cuts and environmental regulations that would cost Washington workers their jobs. He outspent his opponent 2-1, raising a war chest of $250,000. Ravco produced upfront contributions of $5,000 from the National Conservative Political Action Committee and other New Right PACs, with a few strings attached. According to reporter Nick Kotz, writing in The Atlantic, the seed money had to be invested with Viguerie in a direct mail fundraising campaign.
Viguerie had the whole piece of cake, and Cunningham is happy because he won. You can't tell Viguerie what to do. He's the master of his ship, and if you're going to tie your dinghy to it, you go where he goes.
Less than a month after he was elected, Cunningham allowed his name to be used in a National Conservative PAC fundraising appeal, explaining in the mailing brochure that passage of the voter registration bill before Congress would allow George Meany and his henchmen to take over the election process.
The union bosses will have their troops out there on the streets on election day, digging up derelicts, vagrants, and anyone else who will take $1 to cast a vote.
With the money raised by what one right-wing activist disdainfully calls these panic letters, the fundraisers have built a complex and enormously profitable and interdependent business. Some of the organizations for which Viguerie raises funds are continually in debt to him, for example, yet the employees and officers of these organizations do not appear to be concerned by this burden. In interviews with me in March and May 1979, respectively, Paul Weyrich of the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress and John T. Dolan of NCPAC admitted that each of their organizations owed Ravco at least $200,000. They do not worry about such things, Dolan said, because new mailings will keep them afloat. In fact, one professional fundraiser who has worked closely with Viguerie and considers him a friend told me he believes Ravco tolerates the debt for good reasons.
They think Richard's doing him a big favor because they owe him a lot of money, and he doesn't make him pay up. It's like when the guy is winning in poker, and he says he'll let the loser stay in the game if he'll agree to play for double or nothing. Since they owe him money anyway, they think he's doing him a favor. What they don't understand is that in the direct mail business, he's already made a colossal profit off of them, and will continue to make more each time he mails for them, whether they pay off the debt or not. He volunteers to keep them going by continuing to mail for them, so they go ahead. There is one way out of the relationship. They can get out any time they want, but Richard will say, "Okay, but can you pay me now?" There's not much they can do but keep in the relationship, letting him continue to raise money for them while he continues to take his cut.
The fundraiser informed me.
The organizations themselves may lose money, but their employees do not. The PAC employees make good money, even if their organizations are always in debt.
And another conservative activist who has also been involved in direct mail fundraising on a consulting basis explained it this way.
We're creating an entire conservative welfare class in Washington alone, people who cannot do much else, who are doing very well off the $10 checks of little old ladies on Social Security.
In 1977, Ravco raised money for the successful congressional campaign of new rightist Robert Livingston, the first Republican to represent his Louisiana district since 1874. It was an impressive victory, since only 10% of the district's voters are Republicans, but Livingston, with Ravco's help, spent substantially more than his Democratic opponent. A routine investigation by the FEC discovered that Livingston's campaign committee owed Ravco about $40,000. The FEC found no evidence of any illegality. It did remark on the unusual way the debt settlement had been reached. The committee's creditor, Ravco, was also the fundraiser. As an FEC report stated, it
would not, in this commercial arrangement, seem reasonable for the creditor to go to court to enforce its debt, since the debtor would ultimately have to return to its fundraiser in order to obtain the money to satisfy the debt.
In other words, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, the debt was paid, with interest, by April of '78. Some critics suspect that political fundraisers may create organizations solely to function as fronts for direct mail campaigns and primarily to make money for themselves. But blanket charges are probably not really fair. Many individuals involved in these so-called fronts are sincere ideologues, using the direct mail business, however profitable, to build their political movement and to advance the causes for which the funds are raised. In fact, the term plunder is used here not to mean necessarily personal profit, but rather the gathering up of people's money to use for purposes other than those its owners intended. Right-wing PACs frequently loan money to one another, according to reports filed with the FEC, and at least one such organization came into existence through extension of a loan from a similar group. The Committee for Responsible Youth Politics, ostensibly a school for the training of young campaign workers, also functions as a political action committee, raising more than $177,000 from 1976 to 78. Its chairman is Morton C. Blackwell, for years an employee of the Viguerie Company, who left Viguerie in '79 to work for Senator Gordon Humphrey of New Hampshire. At the same time, when Blackwell was an executive of RAVCO and chairman of the Committee for Responsible Youth Politics, FEC reports show the PAC was frequently in debt to Viguerie. Interlocking relationships of this kind led the National Committee for an Effective Congress to file a complaint with the FEC in 1977, charging that the National Conservative Political Action Committee, the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, and the Committee for Responsible Youth Politics might be one committee under RAVCO control and with Viguerie as the central figure. The FEC concluded that each committee is independent. A few knowledgeable conservatives who have worked closely with many of the PAC leaders told me of one vast operation, the individual components of which exist because clients are in debt to their fundraiser. One participant has described to me periodic meetings at which representatives of the various committees meet to decide which candidates are to be supported and how.
They sit around with their pocket calculators
and go around the table discussing different candidates, and one will say,
"We can give 5,000, and another will say, "We can give 1,500, until it's decided."
Another associate of the PAC leaders told me of less frequent meetings that last an entire weekend and are attended by
the money people on the right,
called Red Fox meetings after a lodge, at which the first meeting took place. These sessions map out long-range political strategies. It was at one of these meetings, one participant told me that Viguerie quipped,
"My political principles? That's easy. MONEY.
The limits imposed by the 1974 election laws caused some trouble even for new right fundraisers, but the way around them was readily at hand. Almost every right-wing organization, like many liberal groups, has formed its own tax-exempt foundation, and John T. Terry Dolan of the National Conservative Political Action Committee admitted to me that his group formed the National Conservative Research and Educational Foundation, or NCREF, for
our contributors who want to help but can't go over the $5,000 limit.
Campaign finance laws permit this maneuver. Thus, contributors may give $5,000 to the National Conservative Political Action Committee and another $5,000 to the National Conservative Research and Educational Foundation. This has clearly aided the rise of independent expenditure by political action committees. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down portions of the campaign finance law in '76, ruling that Congress could not impose spending limits on those who wish to advocate or oppose a candidate's election without prior approval of the candidate. That year, the American Conservative Union's Victory Fund ran a $250,000 campaign for Ronald Reagan. Hank Grover, former state legislator in Texas, spent $63,000 of his own money on pro-Reagan activities. And the National Conservative Political Action Committee informed thousands of its donors in '79 of its plans to
actually seize control of the U.S. Senate
in 1980 by earmarking more than $700,000 in independent expenditures for campaigns to oppose 5 so-called radical senators, all Democrats. Spokesman announced that $403,000 was to be used for a campaign to oppose Alan Cranston, with $338,000 of that to be spent on letters to voters. Letters, it is assumed, that will ask for still more money. Dolan said he had hoped the effort would chip away 20% of the vote from their intended victims in the primary polls, see Chapter 11. There were also plans afloat to ease some liberal to moderate Republicans out of office. A New York organization called the Committee to Replace Jacob Javits, some of its members were associated with the Conservative Party of New York, flooded the senator's Capitol Hill office in '79 with postcards.
Dear Senator Javits, happy 75th birthday. Why not quit while you're ahead? Retire in 1980. Sincerely, sign your name here.
The group described Javits as
an allegedly Republican United States senator whose voting record is more liberal than many Democratic senators,
and said,
"It's Jacob Javits' turn to retire or be defeated."
The new right activists have also maneuvered around the limitations of new campaign finance law through the formation of PACs associated with presidential candidacies. Yet these are actually created to allow the presidential hopeful to campaign for lesser office seekers in his party. These committees allow the expenses of campaigning to be paid through an organization technically not for that purpose. They avoid contribution limits. Individuals are prohibited from contributing more than $1,000 to a candidate, but they are allowed to give up to $5,000 to a multi-candidate political action committee, even if it exists primarily to support the campaign activities of a presidential aspirant. They enable a candidate or his allies to raise and spend money to further a campaign without counting it against the maximum spending limits imposed on any candidate who wants to accept federal matching funds. Multi-candidate PACs associated with presidential candidates were expected to raise about $14 million in 1980. The largest of these committees is Citizens for the Republic, formed in '77, according to a committee spokesman, with roughly $250,000 left over from Citizens for Reagan, the campaign committee that backed the former California governor for the 1976 GOP nomination. With the services of Bruce Eberle, this group built a list of 300,000 contributors, and its 1978 budget of $2.5 million exceeded that of the political arms of such traditional special interest groups as the AFL-CIO, the American Medical Association, the National Education Association, and the United Auto Workers. It paid Reagan's traveling expenses, allowing him to campaign almost constantly for GOP candidates and thus collect political IOUs. None of this counted as part of Reagan's own fundraising activities for the 1980 election, which was to be conducted under different auspices. During the last congressional elections, the Reagan Committee gave almost $575,000 to candidates, all of whom would be asked to remember Reagan in 1980. However effective the new right has been in building its movement and mobilizing its constituency through direct mail advertising, this success has come at an enormous cost to those constituents, often unbeknown to most of them. Huge sums of money have been raised to elect or defeat candidates, but much of the money contributed by interested individuals for candidates and causes never goes to the purpose for which it was raised. It ends up at the disposal of the fundraiser, not the candidates or organizations, with the fundraiser deciding what cause to spend it on. Some conservative critics see the booming direct mail business as small-scale hucksterism that was perfected when right-wing publicists and fundraisers dabbled in charities linked to political finance. The situation has reached, in many instances, the proportions of a large-scale scandal. From charities to campaign finance. At least as early as 1970, right-wing fundraisers and public relations experts were involved in charitable fundraising, often with a political flavor. The transition from not-for-profit fundraising to campaign finance was an easy one. One of the earliest of these quasi-charitable operations was the United Police Fund, a project of right-wing fundraiser Patrick Gorman. The United Police Fund, using the Public Trust Foundation of Chicago as a tax-exempt front, in 1970 distributed appeals showing pictures of the families of dead policemen around the graves of the officers. The purpose of the organization, it was said, was to help the widows and children of the slain law enforcement officers. Its fundraising letters were signed by Congressman Sam Devine, an Ohio Republican, who later said he had been deceived by the promoters, who were running the show with what a congressional investigator called an unconscionable contract. So high were the fundraising costs. In 2 years, the project netted a reported $110,000, almost 90% of which went to fundraiser Gorman. The police departments of Los Angeles and New York City barred their employees from any involvement with the organization, and the operation, exposed in the press, dissolved. Viguerie has applied charity fundraising techniques to single-issue campaigns with comparable results. In 1971, Vigiri raised money for an anti-smut group called Citizens for Decent Literature. It still exists, without Vigiri and with a new name, Citizens for Decency Through Law, with far-right California Republican Congressman Robert K. Dornan on its governing board. Its founder and director is Charles Keating, a Cincinnati lawyer who, as a member of President Nixon's Commission on Obscenity and Pornography, wrote a dissent to the commission's final report, later accepted by the President and Senate, which rejected the more liberal conclusions of Keating's colleagues 60-5. Keating refused to discuss his relations with Ravco with me, but an audit by the Charity Frauds Division of the New York State Attorney General's office showed that in 71, Vigiri raised $1.2 million for Citizens for Decent Literature, 84% of which went back to his own company. The next year, Ravco raised almost as much, taking 81.4% home to the fundraiser. An estimated $2.3 million was raised over the 2-year period. In 1977, Ravco raised funds for a project called the Children's Relief Fund, a program of the Korean Cultural and Freedom Foundation. The Children's Relief Fund is part of the worldwide operation of the controversial Reverend Sun Myung Moon of South Korea. Its president is Colonel Bo Hee Pak, widely regarded as Moon's right-hand man and believed to have close ties to the Korean CIA. On its board of directors is Neil Salonen, president of the Unification Church of America. Fundraising literature for this organization states,
As I write you this letter, thousands of little boys and girls are suffering from the terminal forms of malnutrition. What better gift could you give than a gift to fight suffering and death?
That way, of course, was to send money, and lots of big-hearted Americans did. The New York State auditors discovered that, in all, $1,508,256 came back from the appeals, although less than 6.3% ever got back to the needy, starving Asian children.
The disproportionate and wholly inadequate expenditures for the program services, $95,674,
the Attorney General concluded,
was the direct result of the unconscionably high fees of $920,302, 60% of expenses, disbursed to the professional fundraiser Vigiri.
The state of Ohio brought action against the operation, charging that the Korean Cultural and Freedom Foundation with filing a financial statement that was
inaccurate, false, and misleading,
and Vigiri with failing to register as required by law as a fundraiser in the state. Officials concluded that the project had caused
substantial annoyance, inconvenience, and pecuniary injury to residents,
and Vigiri agreed to sign a consent order to limit its costs for solicitations within Ohio. As a result of the investigation, he was temporarily barred from mailing in Ohio and Connecticut. State officials in Massachusetts, Minnesota, Vermont, Illinois, and Arizona, along with the Internal Revenue Service, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Immigration and Naturalization Service, made special inquiries into the New York investigation. During roughly the same period, Ravco was handling the fundraising for another ostensibly charitable group, Bibles for the World, which exists to distribute Bibles in Asia. This group began direct mail solicitation in 1976, and reports for the year ending in 77 show that the solicitation, handled by Ravco, raised $802,028 at an incredible cost of $889,255. Vigiri's fundraising costs thus came at about 112% of the contribution, leaving the organization worse off than it was before it entered the contract. Needless to say, nothing was left with which to distribute Bibles. A similar operation came to light in 1975 when Congressman Lionel Van Deerlin, a California Democrat, investigated a number of charitable organizations and discovered a
charlatan-like operation
called the Underground Bible Fund. This group, he said in congressional hearings,
undertook to persuade prospective donors that for every $2 that came in, there would be 5 Bibles distributed in the native tongue of the Iron Curtain country. Working backward from the mail drop, we couldn't ascertain whether one single Bible had ever been delivered to one single person behind the Iron Curtain, despite more than $200,000 that had been collected.
An aide to Van Deerlin recalls New Right publicist Lee Edwards' involvement in the operation, calling it
a classic case
of a charity that uses a professional fundraiser
who skimmed off as much as 80%.
The same group that conducted the underground Bible Fund operation, the congressman said, was also involved in a scheme called Save Our Symbol, the purpose of which was to convince Americans not to shoot eagles.
All of these were doing quite well,
He said,
and we found they were mingling the mailing lists. They called an excellent list from people who do send money in response to these appeals. They had quite an ongoing business there. Just this one outfit, quite a bit of money is being stashed away, which money was obviously well intended and could have found its way into legitimate charities.
Some observers have criticized the extent to which Viguri controls the mailing lists he builds for clients, to buy or sell as he sees fit, even in the case of not-for-profit charities. To minimize charity abuses, Democratic Congressman Charles Wilson of California has introduced a bill that would require nonprofit organizations to make public the percentages of their contributions that actually go to the causes they represent. New Right spokesmen began to fight back. Conservative Digest, for example, published an article under the byline of former Arizona Congressman John B. Conlon, Republican, defending the fundraisers.
The portions of the bill that deal with expenses and income, the costs of fundraising, and the expenditure of charitable funds raise serious problems. Charitable mailing can be divided into two categories, both with totally divergent purposes and costs of fundraising. One category of mailing is called prospecting, the seeking of new friends and contributors who have never given before. The return from such a mass mailing to prospects would be considered good if it makes a small amount of money or even breaks even. A return of 1 or 2% is common. Wouldn't this cost, if published in the mailing piece, inhibit the efforts to build a list of long-term friends and donors?
The Heritage Foundation also took up the matter. An issue bulletin released by the organization argued that the Wilson bill
would discriminate against new charitable organizations and those with necessarily high fundraising costs,
subjecting religious leaders to vicious accusations of fraud by the knaves at the U.S. Postal Service.
Opponents of H.R. 41 fear that this measure is the first step to a legislative strategy to eliminate tax-exempt status for all nonprofit organizations. By requiring charities to notify their donors of such costs, the Wilson bill will increase the paperwork on every Christian organization by providing each potential donor with financial statements with each appeal, creating additional costs and inevitably lessening the funds each charity can use for its stated purpose.
Affixed to a picture of Conlon was a caption telling the reader that he
defends charities against big government.
And at the bottom of the article ran the message,
reprint permission for this article granted by its publisher.
Its publisher, Richard A. Viguri, funding the single-issue groups. In 1971, Patrick Gorman and Lee Edwards, later to emerge as editor of Richard Viguri's Conservative Digest, started Friends of the FBI, which, in the words of one participant,
produced a Niagara of dollars.
Friends of the FBI was put together ostensibly to express support for J. Edgar Hoover, a hero to new rightists, who was coming under increasing criticism from the liberals and the left. With the help of Louis Kuttner, a Chicago attorney attached to the Tax-Exempt Commission for International Due Process of Law, the partners prevailed upon Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., star of television's long-running serial, The FBI, to sign a fundraising letter. Within 4 months, they had raised close to $400,000, about two-thirds of which, $256,000, was eaten up in operating expenses. The rest was divided among Kuttner, Gorman, and Edwards. Soon, Zimbalist became suspicious, claiming he had been used by the partners, and his lawyers told the group to stop using their client's name, accusing them in a letter of
fraud and misrepresentation.
Pressed to account for the group's activities, the partners announced publication of a study of the FBI, which was subsequently published by the group itself as Who's FBI? The organization still exists and has since issued newsletters and a booklet. America's Internal Security, Its Dangerous Decline, and What to Do About It. In 1974, Viguri raised money for the Americans for Effective Law Enforcement, a law and order group then operating out of Evanston, Illinois. He raised $198,568 and took 90% of the contributions. The next year, when Americans for Effective Law Enforcement stopped using RAVCO, its fundraising costs dropped to 43% of the contributions. Nevertheless, Frank Carrington, its executive director, told me that he was not at all dissatisfied with the earlier relationship, saying he and Viguri are
still good friends.
His group went into the arrangement
with our eyes open,
Carrington said. Americans for Effective Law Enforcement officials were well aware, he said, that the costs of fundraising would be high, so they tucked away between $400,000 and $500,000 well in advance to cover programs they had planned for the year. Carrington said Viguri told him that his group would
barely break even,
but he admitted that
we didn't know how barely.
Ravco raised $202,000 at a cost of $198,000, and
we found we were just trading dollars.
Ravco brought thousands of names of new donors that Americans for Effective Law Enforcement could use for its fundraising, and the group now has its own house list to which it can appeal without Viguri. But when Americans for Effective Law Enforcement show no further interest in continued prospecting, as the process of seeking new contributors is called, Ravco canceled the contract. Now Ravco and Americans for Effective Law Enforcement share the list of donors, and Viguri is allowed to use the names for other fundraising appeals, but only for groups not involved in law enforcement-related issues. Carrington maintains that the 90% figure as cost of fundraising for 1974 is misleading, since his organization already had almost $500,000 set aside for its program before it used Ravco's services. He adds that sum to the $4,000 net raised by the direct mail appeal, which would leave 64% of the year's budget for program activities. A similar report comes from the National Rifle Association, for whom Ravco raised money in '75. That year, Viguri agreed to handle the fundraising for the NRA's Institute for Legislative Action and brought in $5.8 million at a cost of $3.2 million. Even so, a spokesman for the gun lobby said there was no dissatisfaction over the costs. H.K. McGaffin, fiscal director for the Institute for Legislative Action, told me that Ravco's prospecting brought his group an additional 600,000 names, and while the expenses were tremendous, the mailing paid for itself by building the organization's list of contributors. All in all, he said it was a
pretty good relationship,
which ended only because the NRA decided it could handle its own fundraising from now on, working from the list Ravco built for it. In the 3 years that Viguri worked for the NRA, $12 million rolled in, at what cost McGaffin would not say. NRA was happy with the arrangement, and Ravco was happy with the arrangement. Only the unsuspecting thousands who sent their money thinking it would be used to fight gun control legislation and not to purchase others' names and addresses might be offended, and they did not know. The New Right fundraisers have become more and more deeply involved in political finance. In 1970, Viguri raised money for rejected Supreme Court nominee G. Harold Carswell, then seeking the Republican nomination for a Florida Senate seat. Edward J. Gurney, then a GOP senator from Florida, agreed to sign the fundraising appeals. When they arrived in the mailboxes of prospective contributors, the appeals contained a return envelope addressed to Gurney's suite in the old Senate building in Washington. Federal law at the time provided for a maximum penalty of up to $5,000 in fines and 3 years in jail for public officials who received
money or anything of value for any political purpose
in
any room or building occupied in the discharge of official duties.
A spokesman for Gurney said all funds would be sent to an address in Florida. It was just a slip-up by the mailing house, Gurney's spokesman said. The mailing house was Viguri's. Such slip-ups continue. A solicitation from the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, then using the Viguri mailing house, came under fire in '77 when several disgruntled members of Congress found their names had been used in a mailing of some 500,000 letters, reading,
"From Congressman blank."
As might be expected, this was not appreciated by the congressmen who had not given their permission to the anti-gun control group.
I cannot believe there is anyone in Congress more opposed to gun control legislation than I am,
Republican Congressman Robert S. Walker of Pennsylvania said.
However, I cannot and will not condone this kind of irresponsible special interest appeal for money.
Calling the organization's action
highly unethical and grossly ill-conceived,
Walker said the appeal
bears my name in a fashion designed to mislead the recipient into believing that I am sanctioning and sponsoring this effort to solicit money.
Walker asked Citizens Committee Chairman Alan M. Gottlieb to issue a follow-up mailing to set the facts straight. But his response, Walker said,
was to hang up the telephone in the middle of our conversation.
Another congressman to complain was Bob Carr, a Michigan Democrat who opposed the aims of the Citizens Committee.
People all over the United States were misled by this,
he said.
It is gross and wanton fraud to use my name in a way that implied I favor something that I actually oppose.
The Citizens Committee finally agreed to return any funds generated by the misleading solicitation, including a statement to the recipient that the previous mailing
may have led you erroneously to believe that your congressional representative had sent the solicitation or had authorized or otherwise concurred in the use of his name on the solicitation.
The group's chief lobbyist said,
The company that handled the mailings admitted that it was just a mistake, an accident.
Abuse of congressional letterheads by fundraisers has become so prevalent that at least one congressman, Democrat Berkeley Bedell of Iowa, proposed a change in House rules to prohibit any member from mailing on congressional stationery more than 500 copies of any unsolicited message not dealing with official business. Bedell said the use of the letterhead, even when it carries a notice in small print that the message is
not prepared or mailed at public expense,
has a tendency
to make people believe that the cause, whatever it is, has been sanctioned by the United States Congress.
A recent case involves the ubiquitous Robert K. Dornan of California, who allowed his stationery to be used in a fundraising appeal for Larry Pratt of the Gun Owners of America, then seeking to raise a staggering $27,850 for his campaign to win a seat in the Virginia House of Delegates. Pratt's organization, which uses Ravco's fundraising services, has the dubious distinction of having been hit by the Federal Election Commission with the heaviest fines in FEC history. Fines of $11,000 were imposed in 1978 on gun owners and 2 affiliated PACs for making illegal contributions to the parent committee and for failing to register and report as PACs. Huge amounts of money have been raised by the new right PACs, but relatively meager amounts have actually been received by the candidates for whom the money is raised. By and large, the worst offenders have been PACs using Ravco as their fundraiser. However, some PACs independent of Viguri must bear responsibility for their own activities. For example, WinPAC, the Western Intermountain Network Political Action Committee, was the creation of Stan Berger, an unsuccessful Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate in 1976, who lost to Democratic Congressman John Melcher by a 2-to-1 margin, despite Berger's having outspent Melcher $609,000 to $311,000. There is a footnote here which reads, a Berger for Senate fundraising event during the 76 campaign was arranged for the candidate by the staff of North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms and held on federal property on Capitol Hill. Federal law prohibits the exchange of political contributions on federal property. Ostensibly established to support Mountain West New Rightists, the committee's 1978 filings with the FEC show that it raised $187,101.46, none of which, according to federal political election filings, was contributed to political candidates. Several $1,000s, however, were paid in salaries and consulting fees to various Bergers, including Chairman Stan Berger in Bozeman and Belgrade, Montana. Wyrick's Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress in '76 raised almost $1.7 million to give away around $265,000, with about 16 cents on the dollar going to the candidates donors thought they were spending their money to support. 2 years later, with just under $1.2 million raised, the amount contributed to the candidates slipped to $127,000, or a dime on the dollar. The bulk, of course, was split between CSFC and Viguri-owned companies. Nick PAC, whose success its executive director, John T. Dolan, told me is measured in terms of its fundraising, raised even more than the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress in '76, $2.5 million, of which about 16%, or $386,800, went to candidates. In the 1978 congressional elections, Nick PAC raised $1.5 million and contributed $212,000 to candidates. In 1976, Gun Owners of America raised $2.1 million to contribute $153,000 to candidates, about 7 cents on the dollar. Another anti-gun control group, Gottlieb's Right to Keep and Bear Arms Political Victory Fund, the campaign arm of the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, has a record only slightly better than the other groups. In 1976, it raised $77,000, giving $18,600 or 23% to candidates, a percentage that dropped to 12% or $26,250 in 1978, when much more, $217,000, was raised through the mail. Young Americans for Freedom is also in the fundraising business with the Fund for a Conservative Majority. In 1976, this organization, known in recent years as Young America's Campaign Committee, raised $458,000. That's a lot of money for a youth group, to contribute $48,000 or 10% of the funds to candidates. This dropped to 5.8%, about $17,400, little more than a nickel on the dollar in '78, when the appeal brought in $301,000. During this period, the Eberl Company handled the group's fundraising. The Committee for Responsible Youth Politics, a youth group funded by new rightist Morton Blackwell, uses Ravco's services, contributing $22,000 of the almost $88,000 raised in 1976 to candidates, or 25%. 2 years later, it contributed $7,866, or nearly 32% of the $24,700 raised. Support for limiting the power of the political action committees is already growing on Capitol Hill, and in late '79, a bill passed the House to lower the amount of money PACs can contribute to individual candidates. Defenders and detractors.
I am a conservative, and I used to be associated with Paul Weyrich in the Capitol Hill chapter of the New Right,
wrote Washington attorney Louis Ingram, formerly minority counsel to the House Administration Committee, in a letter to all members of the Republican National Committee in 1977.
I am convinced that these people put economic and egotistic self-aggrandizement ahead of national interests.
In the letter, Ingram enclosed copies of a National Observer article analyzing the costs of fundraising for new right PACs that used Viguerie's fundraising services. One of the most vocal critics of these practices has been M. Stanton Evans, the conservative columnist and author.
As far as I am concerned, the real difference between the two elements, the old and new right, is fundraising,
Evans told me.
Richard Viguerie and the group with which he is associated believe in massive direct mail campaigns involving millions of dollars in overhead and mailing costs to give away thousands.
Another critic is conservative Thomas Winter, editor of Human Events.
He has an obligation to hold the costs down,
Winter said.
There is a serious question here.
One conservative PAC operates differently, without questionable activities, the one with which Winter has had the closest association. In 1976, the Conservative Victory Fund, until February of '77 the political arm of the American Conservative Union, raised $231,000 to contribute $101,014 to candidates, a respectable percentage of 44.8, almost 50 cents on the dollar. 2 years later, the now independent committee's record was even better, raising $44,474 with $251,891, or 57% of that going to candidates. Thus, in 1978, Conservative Victory Fund raised roughly one-third of the amount raised by the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, yet it gave away almost twice as much as that organization did. The group also provides valuable in-kind services, with trained firemen assisting in the campaigns to which the Conservative Victory Fund contributes. No plunder here. The fundraisers of the New Right, however,
rape the public,
conservative fundraiser Martin Liebman told me, in a
hideous
business that constitutes a disgrace to respectable conservatives and conservative causes, posing a threat to their reputation and influence.
There are two kinds of people involved in these scams,
another appalled conservative told me.
There are those who climbed on board,
referring to the army of list brokers, copywriters, consultants, and fundraisers,
and the others who pretend it doesn't go on.
It's clear that the fundraising business itself is becoming a potential political issue. The practitioners are coming under increased scrutiny from governmental agencies, and there is mounting support for increased regulation of their activities. Even many voters are becoming aware of the nature of the New Right fundraising operation, and sometimes criticize it. Covering the race for the 22nd Congressional District seat in Illinois in November of '78, I was amazed at the sophistication of the questions raised by citizens at the public forums at which Dan Crane, the Republican candidate, appeared. Crane, brother of the Illinois Congressman Philip Crane, who was running for president, used Ravco as his fundraiser and received the third largest contribution in the country from right-wing PACs for that election, $28,900, from the New Right PACs alone, and more from such traditionally conservative groups as the American Medical Association. When Crane appeared in public, he would invariably be deluged with such questions about campaign finance as,
"How many people, Dan, were invited to be on your advisory committee?" This was a reference to a standard piece of Ravco fundraising that attempts to make the prospective donor feel he's going to play a significant role in the candidate's decision. "How come your opponent and his wife were asked to be on the advisory committee?" Guffaws from the crowds. "Hey, Dan, how come we got a letter from your wife postmarked from Washington, D.C.? This was a reference to an effective solicitation purporting to be a personal letter from the candidate's wife, Judy, 100,000 of which were mailed into the district. Considered to be the single most effective fundraising gimmick for congressional campaigns, the wife letter is routinely used by Ravco, and company spokesmen admit that they are designed to appear to have been individually handwritten, but, like most fundraising material, they are mass-produced. The letters used in the Crane campaign included a photograph of the candidate, his family, and dog, with a reminder from the wife that Crane wrote to the recipient earlier in the month to extend an offer of membership in the candidate's Congressional Advisory Committee. Some 80,000 of the Advisory Committee letters were mailed.
One disenchanted subscriber to the New Right Report wrote,
"The New Right Report is interesting and good, but the price is getting beyond my reach. And what I have read about Mr. Viguerie becoming a millionaire through writing letters for candidates does not set well with me. I fear much of the contributions I have made to Senator Helms's campaigns and 15 some others has gone into his pockets. While many of us are sacrificing to get good men elected, has Mr. V found a gold mine, and is he swimming in wealth at the expense of patriots?"
Some contributors to right-wing causes are annoyed at the frequency with which they are approached by the fundraisers. One reader wrote to U.S. News and World Report following its interview with Viguerie.
"In the February 26th interview with Richard Viguerie on raising dollars for conservatives, there was one question Viguerie did not answer. Is there a danger that you can ask the same people for money too often? It is possible and has been done to me. I am what you might call a rock-ribbed conservative Republican, and I've given as much as I can afford, both in money and services, since I was old enough to vote. Recently, in one 2-week period, I received 12 requests for money from national and state conservative Republican parties and candidates. That is really killing the golden goose. I get so very irritated that pretty soon I'll end up giving them nothing."
One prominent conservative, who wishes to remain anonymous, said of the fundraising practices,
"How anyone of any sensitivity can bear to read those letters scrawled by little old women on Social Security who are giving up $1 they cannot afford to part with without feeling bad is unbelievable."
Liebman, the granddaddy of conservative fundraisers, told me this story.
"Apparently, some of the fundraisers down in Washington started hitting up their donors on the telephone. So this one tells me he's got a little old lady on the phone who apologized because she couldn't afford to give. Seems that she makes ends meet by knitting these little items of some sort which she sells for $2 a piece, and that plus her Social Security check is what she lives on. So when the fundraiser hears this, he says, 'Okay, can you just knit one extra mitten or scarf or whatever and send the money to us?' And she agreed. Can you imagine that? The guy was really proud of himself."
Did the contributors, often sacrificing to send their contributions, understand that most of the money they gave would not be passed on to the candidates for whom they believed it was raised?
"No,"
said Wyrick.
"I don't think they did."
But Viguerie himself defends the practices of his clients, as he told U.S. News and World Report.
"The press has been very unsophisticated and loose in understanding direct mail when they think in terms of half the money is going to us and half to the client. It would be much more accurate to say that the candidate spent half his money on direct mail advertising and half on other needs of the campaign. By the way, about 35 to 40% of the cost of direct mail goes for postage alone. The press is missing the point on direct mail. It is only partly fundraising, it's mostly advertising. Raising money is only one of the 5 or 6 purposes of our direct mail advertising letters. The same letters, besides asking people for money, may ask them to vote for a candidate, to volunteer for campaign work, to circulate a petition among their neighbors, to write letters to their senators and congressmen urging them to pass or defeat legislation. Direct mail advertising is a critically important political tool for conservatives. You've got to remember that most of the press in this country has a left-of-center bias, and if Walter Cronkite and Katharine Graham of the Washington Post fail to tell the people about issues such as common situs picketing or labor law reform, we are stymied. It's like the tree fell in the forest and no one heard it. But direct mail can bypass the monopoly the left has in the media and let us go directly to the people and tell them what the problem is and what to do about it.
The New Right report, published by Viguri, has hailed unsung merits of conservative PACs.
While the money contributed to conservative candidates by burgeoning conservative political action committees is important, their major functions are sometimes less obvious.
The publication states, these include those mentioned by its publisher in U.S. News and World Report. Some New Right publicists defend their record by comparing it favorably to the Republican Party's campaign organizations, some of whose spokesmen have been critical of the New Right's attempts to purge GOP incumbents. In 1977, Ravco raised a total of $25 million compared to $20 million raised by the GOP's House and Senate campaign committees. The difference, says Republican fundraiser Wyatt Stewart III, a former Ravco employee, is what is left over after fundraising costs are deducted. The Republican committees say they get 70 to 80% of what the mail brings in, compared to the 20% or so that gets back to the New Right PACs. William Rusher counters that Republicans can be taken to task for using conservative issues such as the Panama Canal treaties to raise money for candidates who do not support the positions for which the money has been raised. Specifically addressing the question of discrepancies between the amounts raised and given to candidates, Viguri reminds reporters that the initial cost of fundraising are high, but that as the house list of an organization or candidate is built up, the costs go down. He once said that when he is first building a list, it costs $1.20 to raise $1. He has expressed pride, too, that an early prospect mailing for Wallace in '74 broke even. That mailing, he said, provided the former Alabama governor with a list of supporters to whom he could turn in the future to appeal for money, and was a tremendous success. Confronted with such figures and the criticism implied in them, spokesmen for these groups point to the benefits that accrue to groups they raised funds for.
Look, if I had given money and I heard the figures, I'd be disturbed,
said Paul Weyrich of the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress.
People must understand what we are trying to accomplish.
Besides supporting individual right-wing candidates, he said, his organization is working with the others to build an organizational network for future elections.
We spend money to recruit candidates, to train campaign managers, to analyze every vote cast in the House and the Senate, to publish newspapers and weekly reports, and none of this is reflected in the financial reports. People who look at what we spend and how much candidates actually got should look at our total program.
Dolan of NICPAC denies any deception.
I don't think it's so bad we spent so much to raise money,
he told me.
All the mail we send out does some good. It keeps the issues in front of the voters.